Donc, je suis Catherine Ledoux, la coordonnatrice du RISIC, puis je souhaite vous souhaiter la bienvenue, dans le fond, à la conférence d'aujourd'hui. Je vais commencer par présenter la modératrice pour l'événement d'aujourd'hui, Céline Gélina, qui est co-directrice du RISIC et aussi professeure agrégée à l'École des sciences infirmières Ingram de l'Université McGill et aussi chercheur au Centre de recherche en sciences infirmières de l'Hôpital Juif. Pour l'événement d'aujourd'hui, on vous demande de fermer les micros pour éviter d'avoir des bruits de fond. Puis, la période de questions va être à la fin de la conférence, mais on vous invite tout de même à poser les questions dans le chat qui est prévu à cet effet-là, puis on va pouvoir passer à travers vos questions suite à la conférence. Donc, je cède la parole à Céline et bonne conférence.
Merci Catherine. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Merci d'être présent et présente à cette conférence qui va être très utile pour nos membres. Donc, j'ai le plaisir de vous introduire Dr. Linda Furlini. Alors, Dr. Furlini a un Ph.D. en éducation à la santé et elle est spécialiste en éthique de la recherche au CIUSSS du Centre-ouest de l'Île de Montréal. Alors, nous avons l'experte d'un chef de file, je vous dirais, parmi nous ce midi, donc c'est vraiment un honneur. Dr. Furlini, elle a une expertise solide en éthique de la recherche et en éducation de la santé. Elle est très familière avec toutes les lois, les règlements, les politiques de gouvernance en recherche. Donc, je crois qu'on est très choyés. Et dans son background académique, sa recherche s'intéressait particulièrement aux populations vulnérables et aux proches aidants. Donc, aujourd'hui, elle va nous parler d'un sujet qui nous touche de près. Le titre de sa conférence est « At a Distance, Changing and Adapting Research Practices Ethically During a Pandemic ». Elle fera sa présentation en anglais. Comme Catherine vous mentionnait, vous pouvez mettre vos questions dans le chat pendant la conférence. On va les reprendre à la fin. Pour les poser à Dr. Furlini et vous êtes libre de poser vos questions en français ou en anglais selon votre préférence. Alors voilà, sans plus tarder, je donne la parole à ma collègue, Dr. Furlini.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Gélina. So I will present the presentation is in English, but please feel free to ask me any questions in French. En français, je peux répondre des questions facilement en français. Donc, je commence. Each day, as you all know, we experience how COVID-19 has disrupted our daily lives, but it has also changed the traditional ways we conduct research. We are to avoid in-person contact, so research must be conducted at a distance when it is possible to do so. When conducting research at a distance, by the end of this presentation, I hope you will become familiar with ways of conducting research at a distance and identify means of operationalizing ethical principles and gain an appreciation of best ethical practices and become aware of the ongoing need to protect research participants and promote their well-being. The topics addressed today include the pandemic research context, the consent process, collecting data, data storage, compensation, potential psychological risks triggered by the research, the role of the Research Ethics Board, a summary, and a couple of resources. Please note, the content of this presentation is limited to research studies falling outside Health Canada's jurisdiction. For research studies falling under Health Canada's jurisdiction, Health Canada has issued an interim order respecting clinical trials for medical devices and drugs relating to COVID-19. Please refer to this interim order for specific information on the conduct of drug and medical device clinical trials during the pandemic. In today's presentation, I will focus on research procedures and practices involving only virtual or telephone interactions with research participants, and recommendations on operationalizing ethical principles, in other words, highlighting best ethical practices when conducting research at a distance. We have an immediate need to adapt longstanding ethical research practices to ensure research participants are protected and to promote their well-being. But we must also assist researchers as well as their respective team members with guidance on ways to conduct research at a distance ethically. Of course, we all realize that to conduct research remotely, we use different devices, laptops, smartphones, and tablets. A variety of apps can also be used. It's important to know how to use these devices safely and ensure these apps are secure. The Deputy Minister, Pierre Lafleur, sent a letter to the directors as well as the scientific directors of the Health and Social Services Network early in the pandemic. The following instructions were included in the letter. Research activities can be conducted at a distance, and virtual or telephone contact with research participants is preferred until public health restrictions are lifted. Les activités de recherche pouvant se faire à distance, pour les recherches impliquant des participants humains, les contacts téléphoniques ou virtuels avec les participants devaient être privilégiés. Alternate consent procedures are required to conduct research at a distance. One may ask if it is ethical to adopt new informed consent procedures. The justification for alternate procedures to obtain free and informed ongoing consent is supported by the Tri-Council policy statement, the TCPS-2, and I will refer to this document throughout my presentation. This policy statement contains ethical guidelines that Quebec researchers affiliated with Quebec universities and healthcare institutions must adhere. According to this policy, certain types of research require alternate processes for seeking consent. Researchers may request an alteration to consent requirements. These include a requirement to satisfy the Research Ethics Board that it is impossible, impracticable, or inappropriate to address the research question without the requested alteration. REBs must consider whether the requested alterations are justified or whether another approach would make it possible, practicable, and appropriate to follow the normal consent requirements. The Civil Code also contains an article of law that supports alternate procedures for obtaining free and informed consent. According to Article 24, consent to research must be given in writing. However, according to this article, alternative methods for obtaining consent are permitted if the REB considers these alternative methods are justified. The article specifically states, however, consent to such research may be given otherwise than in writing if justified in the circumstances in the opinion of a research ethics committee. The pandemic presents such a situation. We have a moral obligation to respect autonomy. According to the TCPS-2, an important mechanism for respecting participants' autonomy is the requirement to seek free, informed, and ongoing consent. Recruitment forms part of the consent process. Consent encompasses a process that begins with initial contact, example recruitment, and carries through to the end of the participants' involvement in the project. Recruiting participants at a distance can pose challenges or may be no different than recruiting in person. It all depends on the context. In order to respect confidentiality, regardless whether the recruitment occurs in person or at a distance, the person who introduces the study to a potential participant must be someone who is known to the potential participant. The person recruiting must be someone who the potential participant would expect to have knowledge about them, such as a nurse who provides care or administrative technician in a clinic. If the person is not known to the potential participant, it would be viewed as intruding on the potential participant's right to privacy. The potential participant would rightly question how the person contacting them would have access to their contact information or know that they were eligible to take part in a study about their specific medical condition. Initial contact with individuals about a research project should be made by someone that individuals would expect to have relevant information about them, or in other ways that do not inappropriately intrude on their life and privacy. CIHR best practices for protecting privacy in health research. Who should make initial contact? For example, a treating nurse, whether or not affiliated with the study, can make initial contact and introduce the study to a patient, but the remaining consent process should be delegated to a member of the research team with no relationship to the patient, of course, to avoid any possible undue influence or manipulation. This part of the recruitment strategy would be similar whether recruiting is conducted in person or at a distance. What methods can be used to contact potential participants? Patients may be contacted in person or by telephone, and during a pandemic, many patients can be contacted virtually. When are potential participants contacted? Even during a pandemic, patients can be recruited in person. They can be recruited during the patient's hospital stay or before the patient is discharged, or at the time of an in-person visit at a clinic. However, during the pandemic, participants can also be recruited during a telehealth visit. If the patient agrees to learn more about the study, the person introducing the study can ask this patient if their contact information can be shared with a member of the research team. How should potential's contact information be shared? Once a number of patients have agreed to learn more about the study, the recruiter creates a list of their names and their corresponding personal contact information. If the list is sent by email, it should only be sent to the research team via a secure Outlook account within the healthcare network permitted by the MSSS. It should be sent to another secure email account within the healthcare network permitted by the MSSS. For those working remotely, this confidential email transfer is very important. Alternately, the list can be uploaded on a secure institutional server where only the person who is uploading the list, the recruiter, and the research team member who will use it can access this document. This document is to be held on a secure institutional server protected by a unique password. The person uploading the list, the recruiter, should only have access to this document and no other study data. Once the research team member obtains the list of contacts and begins to communicate with the potential participants on this list, the research team member can briefly explain the study to the potential participant, confirm interest, and send a copy of the consent form to this potential participant by email or send a paper copy by postal mail. This ensures that the potential participant has the time to review the information contained in the consent form before consent discussion begins and consent is obtained. When sending the consent form, a virtual or telephone meeting date and time should be included in the communication letter, as well as a password link for the virtual meeting. When conducting research at a distance, participants should have a choice about the method used to obtain consent when possible. They should be able to choose whether they can do so virtually or by telephone. Many people still have no or inadequate internet access or have no or limited computer skills, particularly the older population. What is the information that it should be included in the information and consent form? It should include procedures for obtaining consent, specify whether the consent will be obtained by telephone or virtually, or whether the participant has a choice. Name the app if you are obtaining consent virtually, for example, Teams. Indicate consent will be recorded. Include information about the procedures for collecting data. Name the data, again, if you're using Teams or other apps. Indicate that the data collection procedures, example interviews, will be recorded. On the date of the telephone or virtual meeting, ensure participants are engaged in the informed consent discussion. This discussion should include an explanation of all aspects of the study. The person obtaining consent has a responsibility to ensure that the information provided was understood. The potential participant should recognize that they're not obliged to participate and they can withdraw from the study at any time. The potential participant should have time to reflect on the decision whether or not to participate, and the potential participant should be encouraged to ask questions. In other words, the consent process should provide ample opportunity for the researcher and the potential participant to exchange information and ask questions. This consent process is the same regardless whether consent is obtained in person or at a distance. If the potential participant requires more time to reflect on the decision whether or not to participate, then a second meeting should be scheduled. If the second meeting is held virtually or by virtually, a meeting time, date, and link should be sent to the participant by email. If held by phone, a date and time convenient to both parties should be set, and it can be sent by postal mail. When conducting the consent discussion, a checklist can be a helpful tool. This tool helps the researcher confirm that free and informed consent has indeed been given. This checklist can be expanded or modified. It is but an example. In this checklist, they're asked that you've explained all aspects of the study in simple language. You've explained the study in a language the participant understands, English or French, that you used an interpreter because the participant didn't speak English or French, that you verified understanding, that you provided time to reflect on the information received, that you encouraged the participant to ask questions, and that you scheduled a second meeting if the potential participant requested more time to reflect on the decision to take part in the study. This is an excellent tool to be used whether obtaining consent in person or at a distance. However, I highlight it has added importance when obtaining consent at a distance. I will return to this later in my presentation. Once the consent discussion is completed and the potential participant agrees to take part in the study, begin recording the participant's verbal informed consent. Recording the entire consent discussion that preceded the verbal informed consent is not generally required, but can be recorded with the permission of the participant. Note, alternate consent procedures are required for vulnerable groups. For some vulnerable groups, it may require that the person's name not be recorded. For people, for instance, that may be placed in legal jeopardy, asylum seekers without papers, gang members, or persons with serious substance use disorders. Alternate consent procedures are also required for persons incapable of giving consent, such as minors and mentally incapacitated adults. By Quebec law, the person giving consent on behalf of another must be the person who is legally authorized to do so. However, in addition to obtaining informed consent from a legally authorized representative, it may also be necessary to obtain assent from the actual participants, virtually or by telephone, to the extent they are capable of doing so. In all cases, the Research Ethics Board must approve all consent procedures proposed, and they must be clearly and comprehensively stated in the study protocol or proposal. If you are conducting the consent process virtually, ask the participant to close their camera. It is preferable to obtain only an audio recording of the verbal consent and not to video record the participant for reasons of confidentiality. If obtaining consent by telephone, use a separate recording device. For reasons of confidentiality, never audio or video record on your personal phone. Remember to activate the private number function if you are using a personal phone. To ensure consent is free and informed, have the participant read and record a statement of consent, usually found on the signature page of the consent form document. This is an example. I understand the information that was explained to me as contained in this consent form. All my questions were answered to my satisfaction. I will be sent a confirmation indicating that I agreed to take part in this study. My participation is voluntary, and I can withdraw from the research study at any time without any consequences and without having to give a reason. Withdrawing from this research study at any time will not affect my medical care now, later, in any way where this is applicable. By agreeing to take part in the study, I do not give up any of my legal rights. I agree to take part in the study, and here you should have the name of the specific study title. The statement refers to medical care, but if a study is conducted, for example, on health professionals, the statement should be amended to read, withdrawing from the study at any time will not affect my employment now or in the future in any way. After the participant reads the consent statement, ask the participant to clearly state their full name and the date. Afterwards, the person obtaining consent should read a researcher statement, also usually found on the signature page of the consent document. This statement reflects the researcher's obligation and commitment toward the participant. And this is an example. I, the person obtaining consent, certify that I've explained to the participant or their legal representative, where applicable, the research study information and have answered all questions. I have clearly explained that the participant is free to withdraw at any time without providing a reason and without any consequences. I commit, together with the members of the research team, to respect all conditions described in this consent form. After reading the researcher's statement, the person obtaining consent should state their full name and the date. Afterwards, stop the recording. This is very important, and I will come back to it later. Once consent is obtained, send the participant a confirmation consent by email or postal mail. According to this TCPS2, where consent is not documented in a signed consent form, researchers may use a range of consent procedures, including oral consent, field notes, and other strategies for documenting the consent process. It's important to diligently document verbal informed consent. Documenting verbal informed consent is good ethical practice because it demonstrates transparency and creates a verifiable audit trail. It is important to protect participants, but it also in turn protects the researcher or the person who is delegated to obtain consent. Tools used to document verbal consent include the informed consent discussion checklist, which I previously mentioned in an earlier slide, the verbal consent recording itself, but another tool can contribute to a more comprehensive audit trail, tracking the consent process using a consent log. This tool allows the researcher to capture other details involved in the consent process. For instance, whether the person accepted or refused to take part in the study, the method, virtual or by telephone, the date that the consent was recorded, the person who obtained consent, the date that the consent recording was uploaded on a secure server, the file path where the data is stored, and other comments. Additional processes should also be documented, and they are not limited to that a copy of the consent form was sent to the participant before beginning the consent discussion, that a confirmation of verbal informed consent was sent to the participant after verbal informed consent was obtained. More than one consent law can be created if required. Written consent is considered a more formalized method of obtaining consent than verbal consent. According to the FRSQ, when participants actively sign a consent form, they become more aware of the requirements of their involvement. Consequently, it is possible that verbal consent may be more easily viewed with mistrust and suspicion. Therefore, the use of consent tools presented is prudent and warranted because you have created a robust audit trail and it demonstrates the researcher's vigilance in terms of protecting participants and diligence in terms of documenting the consent process. Ensure the verbal consent recording was stopped before you begin collecting your data. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed one here. Ensure the verbal consent recording was stopped before you begin collecting your data, which means before you begin your interview, focus group, or discussion, or other research activity. At the point you wish to begin these activities, then and only then restart your recording. For interviews and focus group discussions, recording is common, whether in person or at a distance. However, when collecting responses to surveys and questionnaires verbally, over the phone or virtually, researchers sometimes do not record it. It's best practices to record verbal data collection. It's preferable because it permits you to have an audit trail and serves as your source data. In other words, it's traceable. You have evidence to demonstrate the participants' responses. As I mentioned, stop the recording when you have obtained consent and start the recording again when you begin collecting your data. This procedure allows you to create two separate electronic files, one for the participant's informed consent recording and one for the data collection recording. And it is at this point you may add a code or a pseudonym to the file label for the data collection recording. For reasons of confidentiality, without exception, keep the verbal informed consent recording separate from other study data. These two recordings, informed consent and data collection, must be in the form of two standalone files that are stored separately. Store all participant verbal informed consent recordings collectively in one separate folder. Ensure the folder is protected by a unique password and held on a secure server. Keep the data collection recordings separate in another folder with a different password, but again held on a secure server. The strategies to store data securely are comparable, whether in paper or electronically. Storing electronic recordings of verbal consent on a secure server in a computer replaces the traditional signed paper copies of consent forms stored in a locked cabinet. Privacy risks are not limited to solely the consent process. These risks may be inherent during the initial collection of personal information, use and analysis of study data, distribution of findings, storage and retention of information, and disposal of records or devices on which information is stored. The ethical principle of concern for participant welfare underlying the notion of protection of personal privacy is paramount. Researchers must ensure confidentiality and respect personal privacy, regardless whether the study is conducted in person or at a distance. To fulfill this foremost obligation, researchers must take specific measures. Securing data at a distance may involve some adjustments. Researchers may work remotely, but they must still ensure that best practices are followed, such as storing data on a secure institutional server rather than on a hard drive of a home computer. Are the tools and methods you use highly secure? Are they approved for use at your institution and by the REB? Verify. Contact your data security department or other institutional body or the REB. For example, recently, by order of the MSSS, Zoom Pro was recently replaced by Teams throughout the Health and Social Services network. The use of Teams was implemented to improve standards for data security. If you are conducting research outside the institution, ensure that the use of another app like Zoom Pro is permitted. Also ensure that you obtain any data sharing agreements if the data will be shared or stored at another institution outside the Health and Social Services network. I want to briefly touch upon the issue of compensation. Compensation and its delivery method may be different when research is conducted at a distance rather than in person. There is no longer need for parking vouchers or reimbursements for public transportation or a need to provide refreshments. Instead, gift cards or monetary compensation is common. Researchers must consider how this compensation is delivered. It must be done securely, and personal privacy must be protected. No third party should be able to trace that the participant took part in the research. Wish to draw your attention to another ethical issue? the risk of harm. According to the TCPS-2, harm is anything that has a negative effect on the welfare of participants. The types of risks participants may experience can include physical, social, financial, and psychological harms. For the purposes of this presentation, I will focus on the risk of possible psychological harms triggered by the research. For some participants, taking part in interviews and focus group discussions or completing questionnaires may trigger negative emotions such as anxiety and distress due to the sensitive nature of questions asked. When interviews and focus groups are conducted in person, it may be easier to track and monitor participants for any signs of distress or other negative emotions. For instance, interviewers and facilitators can more easily observe body language as an indicator of distress. So how can researchers monitor and track participants for signs of distress if interviews and focus groups or other data collection methods are conducted at a distance? How do researchers deal with such challenges? Whether conducting data collection activities in person or at a distance, researchers should still be on the lookout for early signs of distress. Clearly, these signs are harder to detect at a distance, but they may still be apparent. For instance, the person conducting the interview can detect when a participant changes the subject in response to a question, which may be an indicator of distress. A participant demonstrates signs of distress during an interview or when a questionnaire is administered over the phone or virtually. How should this situation be managed? If signs of distress are apparent, whether in person or at a distance, the response is similar. Researchers should continue the conversation to determine the level of distress. For example, the interviewer can ask the participant if the participant wishes to skip a question, take a break, or if the distress is persistent, ask the participant to put an end. Ask the participant if the participant wishes to put an end to taking part in the study. Depending on the level of distress, the interviewer can suggest or recommend that the participant can be accompanied and referred to an appropriate resource for help, with, of course, the participant's permission. If the participant shows an extreme level of distress or other negative emotion, whereby the person is at immediate risk to themselves or others, urgent action is required. If this type of situation occurs at a distance, the researchers will have to act to ensure the participant receives the help needed as soon as possible. As nurses, I can assume that you possess the clinical training to respond to such a situation. A participant demonstrates signs of distress during a virtual focus group discussion. How should this situation be managed? Two facilitators should always be present during focus group discussions, whether in person or virtually. If a member of a focus group expresses emotional distress when the focus group is conducted in person, one of the facilitators can accompany the distressed participant outside the room and attend to the participant. When a member of a focus group expresses emotional distress when the focus group is conducted virtually, one of the facilitators should contact the research participant privately using a chat feature or by telephone. Once the participant is contacted, then the facilitator can attend to the participant. Depending on the sensitivity of the research topic, emotional distress may be more difficult to detect at a distance. Symptoms may only appear later after study procedures are completed. There may be a delayed emotional response. Err always on the side of caution. When research is conducted at a distance, follow-up phone calls can take on greater importance. It may be advisable to phone participants several days after study procedures are completed. Prioritizing the security and safety of participants is essential. Finally, I would draw your attention to the requirements of the Research Ethics Boards, or REBs. The methods and procedures in this presentation serve only as examples, because all methods and procedures that you anticipate using to conduct research at a distance must be approved by your REB. REBs are empowered to approve, modify, stop, or reject studies and amendments in accordance with ethical principles and legal requirements. If you're contemplating a new study, it must include research procedures. It must include the research procedures that will be used to conduct research at a distance. If an ongoing approved study, if an approved study is ongoing and research procedures need to be changed because the research can no longer be conducted in person, then the protocol must be amended to include new research procedures. The protocol must also include a justification for these procedures, and the justification being that the existing research procedures must be changed due to MSSS directives, which privileges virtual or telephone contact resulting from the pandemic. Researchers may face unexpected and unprecedented challenges in the designs of studies and the manner they are conducted when at a distance. I encourage you to consult your Research Ethics Board for support. They can provide advice and guidance documents. At the CIUSSS Centre-ouest Montreal, we have created a guidance document for obtaining verbal consent. It contains much of the same information that is included in this presentation. Extraordinary times push us to adapt our research projects. Conducting research at a distance presents challenges, but these can mostly be overcome. Ensure robust procedures and that these procedures are comparable to in-person methods. Ensure that recruitment strategies and consent processes are complete and comprehensive. Protect confidentiality during recruitment. Ensure a thorough and comprehensive consent discussion. Document the consent process. Create an audit trail, including checklists and logs. Data collection can begin after consent is obtained, but it is of utmost importance to ensure that the recorded verbal consent is kept separate from the recorded data collected. Ensure that study data is safely stored if you're working remotely at all times, but particularly if you're working remotely. When the possibility of psychological harms exists, procedures require reflection and serious consideration. Ensure procedures to deal with negative emotions, such as distress, are in place and clearly delineated in a detailed plan added to the protocol or proposal. Protocol, proposals, and consent forms must include all study procedures put in place to conduct research at a distance as they affect participants. My main takeaway message I wish to leave you with is that the core ethical principles that support best practices, respect for persons, concern for welfare, and justice remain the same, regardless of the type of study and its accompanying procedures. Only the manner these principles are operationalized differ when conducting research at a distance. I've also added 2 resources, the MSSS webpage on Éthique de la Recherche, and I've also included the TCPS guidance document. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Furlini. Very, very interesting presentation touching on such important topics in research. Alors, je vois qu'il y a déjà des questions dans le chat. Donc, maybe I can start with those. And if you have other questions, just feel free maybe to add to the chat, or if you prefer to raise your hand, and we'll monitor your questions. So there are two questions that are kind of related, and it's about verbal and written consent. So should they both be obtained? So I will let Dr. Furlini answer this. And should a copy of the full consent form be sent to participants before getting the verbal consent?
I will answer the second question first.
Okay.
The full copy of the consent form should be sent to participants. So it's no different than if you're obtaining consent in person. The second question, verbal and written, the point is that we would obtain, according to the Civil Code and guidance document, we should be obtaining consent, written consent. But because of the pandemic, we may not be able to. So we have to adapt and create other consent procedures and make sure that the consent is obtained in a fashion that is ethical and secure. So there are some people that conduct, and this is why I stayed away from this in this presentation, because there were some people even before the pandemic that would send a copy of the consent form, that is, if the RRB approved such a thing, and have the participants sign electronically and return the consent form. So I know that exists for some studies.
Okay, so it means that the verbal consent that is recorded,
yes,
can replace the written. We don't need both.
You don't need both. You don't need both. Sorry, I misunderstood the question.
Okay, good.
But again, it has to be well documented. It just can't be, you're reading something and as I presented, it is very important to create an audit trail on what you've done. And
yeah, that's very helpful. The other question is about also informed consent, but using online survey tools like Qualtrics, for example.
Okay, I didn't touch that as well because I think that participants would have access to that whether or not it was at a distance, if I'm not mistaken. You would send the Qualtrics link by email in any case. I don't think doing that, using Qualtrics at a distance or using that tool would make any difference whether it was done in person or whether it was done remotely. Because when you organize your study, many researchers were using Qualtrics before the pandemic. So how did they send the link to the participant? And for that reason, I didn't touch upon it because I think that doesn't change just because of the pandemic, unless someone has some other way of seeing the situation.
So that question was from Andrea Van Hals. So I don't know, Andrea, would you like to, do you need more details or specific questions?
Yes, sorry, thank you. I was just wondering, I think some people are going towards that. They were maybe not using it before the pandemic, but going towards that now with the with new approaches. So I'm just wondering what the best practices are.
Well, I think Qualtrics is fine because I understand that I was responsible for reviewing studies in the past, and when I'd see the use of Qualtrics, it was a common tool. And what happened, so I don't think anything really changes. I can understand that more researchers are using it instead of, using other tools. It just has to be done securely. You might, if you're using Qualtrics at McGill, you might need a data sharing agreement. You have to make sure that the participant has a unique link and so on. I don't think there's any difference whether that's done remote, because it won't make a difference. You're conducting research clearly at a difference, but at a distance, but it doesn't make a difference because you could have done that you could have conducted that procedure before the pandemic as well. I focused on informed consent because that is really important, because that we usually used to obtain consent in person. So.
Does that answer, Andrea?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
OK. J'ai une autre question dans le chat. En fait, c'est des conseils. C'est de Lynn Baudet. Donc, des conseils lors d'études d'implantation et de déploiement d'intervention dans la communauté et non en milieu de santé, j'imagine en milieu de soins. Dans la communauté, peut-être, Lynn, si tu voulais préciser.
Oui. En fait, c'est ça, c'est déploiement d'intervention virtuelle dans la communauté et non pas en milieu de santé là, ou d'hôpitaux, etc. Là. Donc, c'est à ce niveau-là.
Oui, j'ai concentré au niveau hospitalier, mais c'est sûr, en communauté, là, il y a des études qui se passent. Et des fois, on a des populations très vulnérables, et dont j'ai mentionné, des fois, il ne faut pas documenter le nom du participant. Ça dépend le contexte, mais on a des études où on obtient le consentement verbal de la même façon. On contacte c'est quelqu'un qui est dans le centre communautaire, qui fait le recrutement. Et par la suite, quand la personne qui est déléguée à obtenir le consentement appelle le participant, il suit les mêmes directives. Il appelle le participant potentiel, il explique l'étude, puis il obtient le consentement verbal de la même façon que j'ai expliqué dans la présentation. Je ne sais pas si je réponds à votre question.
Oui, très bien. Merci beaucoup. Merci.
OK, merci. The next question is about best practices for sending monetary compensation. It's from Lydia.
Okay. What we don't want is somebody to trace back a third party, because sometimes you can delegate that to somebody else. I'll use the example I have in person. And I know I was part of this at one point. Somebody was issuing, a researcher was issuing parking vouchers, but the parking department wanted the name of the participant. So you cannot trace the person who is participating in a study. A third party should not be able to know that a participant took part in a study. So when you're doing this online, just be careful. Like I've heard of things where the compensation is delegated to an agency or something. So I am putting it out there, just be aware, because if you're sharing this information, you're making somebody else handle it. You said you were going to keep the information confidential, and then you're sharing it with a third party for them to handle the payment and so on.
Thank you.
So could I clarify that? Sorry, this is Lydia, the person who
Sure.
asked the question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm wondering, does a bank count? Like if you send an indirect transfer, are they a third party, I guess is what I'm wondering.
I don't think so, because it depends, like you're sending it. So then the person has to deposit. I would have to look that up, but I don't think so. I know it's happening. I know people are sending money transfers. Because the bank, because I'm considering when you send money to somebody, they know it's from, so it would be a bank account set up by the research team to pay this participant. Then I don't see a problem.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Any other questions or comments? I do have a couple, but I just want to check with the group first.
Hi, I do have a quick question.
Wait, vas-y.
Yeah, let's see if I can put my video on. Anyway, sorry, I'm on my little phone. So I have a question for you, Linda. It's Stephanie Robbins. I used to work with you at the Jewish.
Yes.
Do you see any extra psychological distress that is resulting from COVID itself, regardless of the context of the study? So even if the study was perhaps on a sensitive question, such as postpartum depression or something like that, do you also see that there's an extra burden of the context of COVID, and is that somehow being addressed in extra services or extra care or extra referrals? Do you know what I mean? I don't know if I'm.
Yeah, when we review a study, this is what the Research Ethics Board does. So in the context of a pandemic, we become extra sensitized to questions that may trigger an emotional response. So, you know, you might be just asking a question, you know, you might be doing some exercise program, but you're doing them with older people or you're doing them with somebody else. Do they have a resource to whom you can refer them to? And so we would insist that the researchers include that in their protocol. And I think that's very important because it depends again on what is it that you're asking. And you know, if it depends, if you're asking, especially if you're asking, let's say you have a cancer study and you're asking people how they're feeling. Well, for sure, we're going to make sure if you're asking how people's, you know, how they're feeling mentally, and for sure, we're going to say, okay, if something happens, who are you going to refer them to? Because, you know, and there's different levels too of distress. You might, you know, provide a list of resources. Then, you know, you say, if this happens, usually you create a protocol. If this happens, you know, we'll ask you, do you want to stop? Do you want to take a break? Do you want to, if the stress is at a higher level, you may take charge. We ask the researcher to take charge of this participant and refer them to the appropriate resource. And if that triggers, if it's very extreme, then, because I'm speaking to nurses, I would assume even if it's virtually, they know how to react, how to deal with this participant because they have their contact information and how to deal with that. But what's important to answer your question, that it's all detailed. What are you going to do? And so we become more vigilant in that score because, and I think that's right, because in this context, there are a lot of people that you may have done, or you're dealing with a vulnerable population, and it might have been vulnerable, but we have to make double sure that the resources are there. One problem is that we've confronted is that sometimes the resources aren't there.
That's the point.
Yeah, that's a big problem. And so we're trying to deal with that as well. And
okay.
Yeah, maybe I'd like to share an example related to this discussion. So we are nurses and we are PI on products, but we don't have neither the resources or the power to ask for a consultation to a physician, for example. So physicians who are PI, I think it's easier for them in terms of providing like a direct consultation, medical if needed. But as nurses, I find it a bit more challenging. And we have to find other ways to offer some kind of resources and support. without becoming the therapist of our participants. And well, in terms of resources that we're using is either if it's employees, it's rather support resources from their institution that are already in place, and there are specific ones related to COVID, if it's a COVID related topic or not. But also there are other associations offering online 24 hours, 7 days a week. So there are other resources I think we can think of and include, and this is what we did because I'm not a physician, so I cannot offer a medical consultation, but there are other ways to offer and inform of available resources.
I didn't realize that. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I didn't realize that nurses have more challenges, because I know that it can be very challenging even for physicians. So depending on the situation. Yes, resources like suicide, I forget what it's called. Those are excellent resources and so on. But the problem is, if it's urgent, you have an obligation. And if it's distress, you should still try and accompany the participant to a resource. Like whether even that means, you know, I suggest you go to the emergency, or I suggest you see your physician, you know, and maybe as a nurse, you can facilitate that, call the doctor and say, listen, this is what's going on, and see what, you know, what they can do. You know, if you have access to the person's physician, contact information for the physician, and help them out to get to that resource. But it is a big problem. I agree.
Yeah. Okay. So if I move on in the chat, we have a bit more there. So maybe I'll ask Rena. Rena, how do you? Can you talk about yes, your compensation that you received? And
okay, so
yeah,
it turns,
yeah.
Thank you. I was in a study. Hi, Linda. I was in a study and I received a card, a master card with my name on it, which says BQC participant. I did it. I spent the money. Thank you very much. Was that legally done? Was that correctly done?
I reserve my opinion. I find that although I know there's a big push to have third parties do this, and that's why I brought it up.
Right.
And I leave it to you all to think about it. We're telling the participants that the information will remain confidential, but we're sharing it with a third party to handle this. So I put it out there, and people can do what they want. There might be some REBs, well, clearly, that are accepting this, and there's a push in that direction. But I'm just giving you, because I'm in research ethics, I'm just bringing up the topic to have you reflect on, because a lot of participants would not know that their information is being shared to a third party.
Right. And I just thought I'd share and let you know that I actually did it.
Thank you, Rena.
Thank you. Next participant, Gabrielle, a question about family presence. So do you mean family present during consent or data collection? So maybe if you want to clarify.
Yeah, hi. That question came to mind when we were talking about the psychological support. So I'm a student, it's my first time doing research. Maybe this is something that you all know that I don't, but in terms of, is that something that we can plan for, or ask if the participant would be more comfortable, or like in terms of a social support kind of net in case they were to need that, you know, instead of referring, maybe we can't refer, or we don't need to specifically refer to a psychologist or to other services, but can we plan for having that kind of psychological support backup? And the context is for me in Indigenous communities at a distance.
Okay, that's a, yeah, so that has its own requirements. I would also, if you're doing that, first of all, you'd have to do this in conjunction with the community, if that's at all possible. And what a researcher should do from the beginning is plan. So you have a plan. And what type of questions would you be asking? Sensitive questions, I imagine, and since it's a psych study?
It's exploratory, very open about their experience in nursing education in Quebec.
Okay.
But it can go towards, yes, experiences of racism, and yeah, it can get sensitive for sure.
So your question is a good one. When you're starting off as a new researcher, you've got to develop a plan and add it to your protocol. If you notice minor distress, you have a resource and you accompany them to, no, you have a resource. And usually for nurses, I think, I don't know what happens in Indigenous communities, but where they're conducting where they're undertaking their studies, there are resources either at the university or at the hospital they can consult. So you can put that in the consent form and protocol. Then if the level is higher and they can access psychological resources. So that I think is covered. But again, with Indigenous research, you should always consult the community and see if there are other resources there and how they feel about that. Because you're working in partnership with them. If I'm
Usually, yes. I think the approach we're taking is individual rather than by community, because we're casting a broad net of individual nurses who are Indigenous about their experience of nursing education in Quebec. So they are, independent people who are capable of making that decision if they want to take part in the research in that way. And it doesn't impact, from what I read on the TCPS Chapter 9, it doesn't impact the community. Therefore, I can go through the TCPS, I forget which section it is, describes the individual approach. I was just wondering the complexity of, like, if family was there, do I have to create a whole set of paperwork for that option? Or is that something you've not really encountered, having family present?
We haven't had that many studies, but I don't know. I would still consult a leader in the community and explain your situation. And because maybe some people would be better off going to their community for help. Like it's a presumption, we don't know. And so you have the university or hospital resource, but maybe it doesn't hurt to ask and to consult. And that's how you build your protocol, and you can put it in the protocol, which gives it more credibility when you present it to your REB.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Josiane aurait une question concernant le recrutement.
Oups. Oui, bonjour. OK, en fait, j'aurais une question pour le recrutement, mais j'ai une autre question aussi concernant la confidentialité au moment de l'entrevue pour la collecte de données. Concernant le recrutement, comme vous avez si bien dit, en passant, votre présentation était absolument excellente, très, très intéressante et très pertinente. Comme vous avez si bien dit, que le premier contact pour le recrutement doit se faire par une personne qui est connue des participantes. Bon, je suis justement dans le processus là, de soumettre à un comité d'éthique où je vais aller faire mon étude dans un établissement de santé. Et je me demandais, étant donné que je connais pas les gens dans cet établissement-là, donc pour établir le premier contact, le comité d'éthique m'a donné déjà des informations, mais dans une étude antérieure, une fois que le premier contact avait été fait, qu'on avait identifié une personne à l'interne que j'ai rencontrée, traditionnellement, je veux dire, moi, j'allais sur place, rencontrer les équipes de soins, donner toutes les informations Mais là, dans le contexte de la pandémie, je veux dire, qu'est-ce qu'on peut demander à la personne contact? Je veux dire, je ne sais pas si vous comprenez, les gens sont déjà tellement occupés en ce moment, il y a tellement de pression sur les infirmières, sur les professionnels. Je ne sais pas, là, qu'est-ce que je peux demander à cette personne-là, juste de remettre une lettre d'information seulement? Qu'est-ce qui serait acceptable?
Vous soulevez un très bon point, un très bon dilemme très pertinent. Et puis, à cause de la situation, il faut trouver d'autres moyens. Alors, c'est ça. Alors, quand les infirmières, les réunions, j'imagine, ils n'ont pas le temps de parler là, des nouveautés comme un projet de recherche. Vous pouvez demander, faut avoir l'appui, toujours une lettre d'appui là, des infirmières, là, s'ils peuvent au moins distribuer la lettre. Puis, si vous avez le temps de communiquer avec un de ces professionnels, puis leur demander si eux, ils peuvent recruter, ils peuvent suggérer des participants, si on le temps. Et puis, c'est un problème. C'est vraiment, là, c'est un problème. Et c'est d'aller essayer de trouver le soutien et la pertinence de l'étude et l'expliquer à les infirmières, les personnes, les chefs d'équipe, là, que la recherche là, est très pertinente et pourquoi vous avez besoin de quelqu'un pour vous aider à recruter. Et bon, c'est le mieux que je peux faire. Du côté du comité d'éthique, il y a la faisabilité, le comité ou la convenance. Il y a le comité d'éthique, il vérifie si tout si la conduite est faite d'une façon éthique. Mais la convenance, est-ce que c'est faisable l'étude? Est-ce qu'il y a assez de ressources? Alors là, c'est là où peut-être vous allez rencontrer des problèmes. C'est pas vraiment... Des fois, c'est pas le comité d'éthique. Et puis, c'est ça. Alors, c'est essayer d'obtenir des lettres d'appui et puis peut-être travailler avec eux pour que ça soit le moins intrusif possible, que vous puissiez recruter. Vous pouvez développer des fiches. S'il n'y a pas de problème avec ça, pour distribuer. Et puis, si vous le permettez.
Parce que c'est sûr qu'actuellement, de recruter des professionnels de la santé pour participer à un projet de recherche, c'est pas facile. Alors, ma deuxième question, c'est justement par rapport à ça. Dans ma méthode, ça va être des entrevues individuelles qui vont être faites soit par téléphone ou par virtuel selon la convenance des participantes. Mais encore là, si par exemple, les entrevues se passent virtuellement à la maison, alors que tout le monde est en télétravail en ce moment, qu'il peut y avoir le mari, les enfants qui sont à l'école et tout ça, comment on peut assurer aussi la confidentialité ça veut dire que la personne doit avoir accès à un bureau fermé, pouvoir fermer la porte, ne pas être dérangée pendant cette période-là. Ça pourrait pas se faire nécessairement au téléphone non plus. Ça pourrait pas se faire sur les lieux de travail non plus parce qu'encore là, dans un établissement de santé, c'est difficile. Alors, cette partie-là aussi c'est pas facile dans le contexte actuel de la pandémie de procéder à des entrevues à distance.
Encore des bons points. Moi, je n'avais pas compris que c'était des professionnels que vous voulez recruter. Alors, quand c'est des professionnels, c'est ça. Dans le contexte, présentement, c'est peut-être de souligner l'importance d'avoir leur point de vue, de qu'est-ce que vous dites. Ça, c'est vrai, qu'est-ce que vous dites là, d'assurer la confidentialité des personnes qui font du télétravail. La seule chose que vous pouvez faire, c'est que virtuellement, ça peut être difficile, mais peut-être vous pouvez obtenir, vous demander si c'est possible qu'ils sont capables de vous parler, qu'il n'y a pas des enfants, qu'il n'y a pas de... Si c'est possible. Par téléphone, des fois, vous pouvez enregistrer par téléphone. Peut-être la personne peut sortir dehors de la maison et passer en entrevue de cette façon-là, dont la personne peut partir de la maison et là, vous pouvez l'appeler au téléphone. Ça, c'est une suggestion. Encore là, c'est pas facile. C'est pas facile pour les chercheurs et c'est pas facile pour les personnes à la maison.
Non, c'est sûr. Puis dans le contexte de la pandémie aussi, le fait que ces gens-là sont tellement déjà sollicités, surchargés, sous pression, de leur demander en plus de donner du temps pour participer à une recherche. Effectivement, j'ai l'impression que le recrutement ne sera pas facile. Bon, en tout cas, je vous remercie beaucoup.
Bien, je veux juste ajouter que récemment, j'ai appris que quelqu'un, une infirmière, non pas une infirmière, c'était un autre département, et ils ont fait un sondage, des entrevues, et apparemment, les professionnels de la santé, ils étaient contents, ils voulaient partager leur vécu. Alors, ça se peut que ça dépend de la recherche, mais ils n'ont pas eu, c'est ça qui m'a été dit là, qu'ils n'ont pas eu tant de difficultés parce que les gens voulaient partager, ils trouvaient que c'était important que quelqu'un sache qu'est-ce qu'ils ont passé.
Oui, c'est vrai, vous avez raison. Oui, merci.
Oui, c'est un bon point, effectivement. Alors, je ne sais pas s'il y aurait d'autres questions, commentaires. Je vois beaucoup de merci, excellente présentation dans le chat. Je pourrais passer peut-être à mes questions. Alors, il y en a une, c'est pour me rassurer. So I saw in one of your slides that the MSS directive is more towards teams. So what about projects which were approved with Zoom Pro? Is it still okay?
That's it. Because you're affiliated with McGill or University of Montreal? McGill.
McGill.
But even University of Montreal. What happens is that we have to be cognizant that people are working with other licenses. And so within the healthcare network itself, we've received a directive. It's Teams and only Teams. So I can't call you using Zoom. Okay? So when you submit your study, if you're conducting the study because you're using it remotely and you explain you're using McGill, I can't promise, but what I have understood is that there won't be a problem.
Okay.
But if you're in the institution and you have to conduct an interview, then I'm not sure you can do that.
Because let's say, well, I have a project approved with Zoom Pro.
Yes, I know. But this directive came out afterwards. So
yeah,
we're holding meetings to discuss this issue because we know that you're using Zoom Pro. That's McGill gives you the license. It's the university has the license. So we don't see that as so much of a problem. It may be more of a problem for other types of studies, or if it's just conducted within the confines of the CIUSSS. But you're not doing that. So, let's say it was patients in the hospital and they're in the hospital and you're in the hospital, then you might have to use Teams. So I will get some clarification. The directive was meant for the institution, but very often research is kind of an afterthought.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'll stay tuned on this one.
I wouldn't panic.
Okay. So my other question was related to phone interviews. So you mentioned not use a personal phone or recording on a personal phone. So I know that with cell phones, you can block your phone number. So when you call someone, the person receiving the call cannot see your name and your phone number.
That's right. But I said that. Maybe you missed it.
Okay.
I did say that you should remember to do that, to block.
Okay.
And
Okay. So
you can use your personal phone. There's no problem, but
okay.
don't record on your phone.
Okay.
Trace, after to delete it, there's always a trace. That's why you should use another device when you're
okay. Okay. So the recording should not be done on the phone.
That's right. The
Okay.
should not be done on the phone. You should use an outside device to record, another device to record.
Okay. All right. Okay, that's clear. Thank you. Okay. So I don't see other questions besides if it will be accessible. So the webinar and the presentation. So yes. So Catherine, maybe if you want to provide some details on this.
The PowerPoint and the recording will be accessible on our website under the events section, and it will end up on the the first page of our website too in the next few days.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So
I'd like to just say thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to the research community, because very often we don't have that opportunity, and it helps because to avoid wasting the researchers' time and avoid wasting the REB's time, if you know what to expect, it's always easier on the researchers, and I've been on both sides, so I know very well what it's like. So, thank you.
Well, thank you